Hey guys, so with the new Luna 1 version trailer, we got an exciting announcement stating that players will be able to get one free constellation for up to 4 5-star characters that are released up until Sumeru, with the Archons and meta characters that will actually impact the value of your account like Yelan, Kazuha, and Alhaitham not being available to be chosen for the free constellation. This announcement also stated that players will be able to do this by completing dailies and spending 120 resin for 5 days a week for at least 8 out of the 12 weeks that the event will be up for, meaning that as long as you can consistently do your dailies and consistently use your resin, you'll easily be able to get the free constellations. We also got news for how to finally get a character to level 100, which can be done by getting an extra copy of an already C6 5-star character, so that you can get one masterless Stella Fortuna, which will increase your character level beyond 90 by 5 levels, up to a maximum of 10 levels beyond 90, meaning that sadly, you'll need 2 extra copies of a C6 5-star character to reach level 100, since you'll need to level up your character by 5 levels twice. Now, why do I even bother to mention all of this? Well, some constellations for characters this old are pretty bad, to the point to where you'll actually benefit more from getting some masterless Stella Fortuna than some of the constellations. Anyways, because of all of these news, I've decided to place all the noteworthy constellations on a tier list to show you which ones you should prioritize so that you won't regret your decision and have to wait months until your next free constellation. Also, for a little bit of context, I won't be covering most C3s or C5s since the majority of them only increase skill or ultimate damage by around 16%, which will typically fall under the yuck category. Anyways, starting off with the standard characters, well, considering that they're standard, they'll typically be ranked a tier lower than their counterparts, simply because they're far more accessible than the other constellations on this tier list, and thus they aren't that high of a priority. For Jean, her C2 is noteworthy since it increases attack speed by 15%, which is a nice increase to Wanderer, a teammate who she synergizes with pretty well at C4. But other than for Wanderer, the attack speed isn't that important, so it's a bad constellation that I forgot to put in the rest of the images in this video, so I'll just put this notice here. Her C4 is also noteworthy because it allows her to act as a pseudo Farusan with an Anemo main DPS, which allows her to be an actual viable support, especially because her healing also synergizes with Furina, so her C4 is definitely a mid-level constellation. For her C6, it lets you become practically invincible with other sources of damage reduction provided by characters like Jing Shuo or Zhongli, which is pretty situational because the majority of the time you won't really need to worry about taking absolutely no damage since you're not typically at risk of getting one-shots. So for her C6, which again is only OP, which is only overpowered with other sources of damage reduction in specific scenarios, is going to be niche. For the Luke, most of his constellations literally have anti-synergy with his skill and basic attack playstyle. What's even worse is that his plunging playstyle is far more viable than his skill and basic attack playstyle, so the majority of these constellations are pretty much wasted. Now, even though his C6 is pretty noteworthy, it's still yuck because it's only good for his inferior playstyle and he's a standard character. For Chi-Chi, even though I'm pretty sure the majority of us have already unlocked all of her constellations because this game hates us, I'll still go over the noteworthy ones just in case the person who stole all of our luck is watching this video. They all suck, so don't even get them, just yuck. For Mona, her C1 is mediocre for vape and charge reaction teams, and her C4 is also a mediocre 15% crit rate boost, but they're bad cause she's a standard. For Kaching, her C4 gives her 25% attack and her C6 gives her 26% electro damage bonus, which are all pretty mediocre amplifying effects, so like with Mona, they're also bad. For Tenari, his C1 is pretty bad since it's a pretty mid boost to a standard character's DPS. His C2 is also bad for the same reasons, and his C4 is also bad for the same reasons. But his C6 is mid, since it's a significant DPS increase to a standard character. For Dehya, her C1 increases her damage to the point to where she can actually be a sub-viable on-field DPS, so it's mid. Her C2 increases the duration of her skill, which is really good for off-field Dehya, so it's also mid. Her C4 is decent for energy recharge, but it's still pretty bad, and her C6 is honestly honestly a massive boost to her DPS because it allows her to do a ton more punches with a ton more crit stats, so it's viable. For Klee, her C2 and C4 are really the only noticeable constellations because her C2 decreases defense by 23%, which is an extremely rare amplifying effect, and thus it's incredibly undiluted, but considering that Klee has fallen off by quite a bit, I'll place it in mid. Her C4 increases her DPS by a ton, but again, since Klee's DPS is pretty bad, this increase isn't too noteworthy, and thus it's a pretty bad constellation. For Tartaglia, most of his cons just help him with damage and energy by a small amount, with others helping with his cooldowns. His only noticeable constellation would be his C6, but even then, it isn't too big of a game changer if you're playing Tartaglia how he's meant to be played, so it's a pretty bad constellation. For Albedo, his C2 is his only noticeable constellation since it fits his defense scaling nuke playstyle. It increases his ultimate damage based on his defense by a ton, but I still don't think this constellation is worth it considering he isn't that viable anymore, so it's pretty mid. For Ganyu, her C1 is a decent increase to cryo DPS, so it's pretty mid. Her C4 is decent on non-melt teams since she can give the entire team a 25% damage boost, which is also around the realm of mid. And for her C6, it lets her do a ton of front-loaded damage, so it's peak. For Xiao, his only noticeable constellation would be his C6, simply because it's fun to zap around, but it isn't too great of a DPS increase, and it's a bit conditional, since you need at least 2 enemies to activate it, so it's pretty bad. For Hu Tao, obviously her C1 is going to be incredibly valuable, since it lets her spam her charge attacks. Her C6 is also going to be noteworthy since it maxes out her crit rate for 10 seconds every 60 seconds, so you'll still typically want to build her with a ton of crit rate for the 50-second downtime of her C6. Thus, her C1 is going to be placed in meta, but her C6 is going to be placed in bad. For Eula, her C4 is yuck, with her C1 and C2 being mid since they only increase her physical damage bonus. Her C3 is actually pretty good though, since it's a decent boost in damage for pretty much her only source of damage, so it's mid. And her C6 is actually insane, since chances are you'll be able to consistently max out her ultimate stacks, which would result in around 100 to 200% more DPS, so it's definitely peak. For Ayaka, her noteworthy constellations would be her C2, since it increases her ultimate damage in AoE. Her C3, because similarly to Eula, it provides a decent damage boost to her main source of damage, and her C4, since it reduces defense by 30%, which again is a really good amplifying effect since defense shred is heavily undiluted. Now considering that Ayaka is back in the meta because of Escoffier, her constellations will hold much more value, so her C2 is gonna be viable, her C3 is gonna be mid, and her C4 is gonna be peak. For Yoimiya, the only noticeable constellations would be her C2 and C6, but even then, they aren't too big of a DPS increase, and considering that Yoimiya fell off, well, they're both bad. For Kokomi, her noteworthy constellations would be her C4 and C6, because they increase her attack speed, provide energy, and a ton of hydro damage bonus, so her C4 is definitely a viable constellation since it synergizes perfectly with her role as a driver, and her C6 increases her damage by a good margin, but her damage is only as good as that of a viable sub DPS, so her C6 is going to be viable. For Ito, the majority of his constellations just increases damage by a decent amount or give him some energy, but his C6 gives him 70% crit damage and lets him do around 50% more ultimate slashes, which is a massive boost to his DPS. Still, because he has fallen off by a massive amount, his C6 is gonna have to go in mid. For Shanha, her C1 lets her act as a cryo battery and allows her to apply both her tap and held skill damage boosts, which is pretty mid. Her C2 has some nice supportive value since it allows her to have near permanent ultimate uptime, and it increases cryo damage by 15%, which is also pretty mid. Her C4 is decent since it increases her personal damage by a good amount, but because her personal damage sucks, it doesn't really matter, so it's bad. And her C6 is only powerful with normal and charge attack characters, so it's niche. For Yaemiko, her C1 provides a good amount of energy, which is really only nice for off-field Yaemiko, so it's niche. Her C2 increases the range and damage of her skill, which is definitely viable. Her C4 provides a practically permanent 20% electro damage bonus to your team, which is pretty mid, and her C6 allows her skills to ignore 60% of defense, which is only meta since it's exclusive to her skill. For Ayato, his C1 is yuck, since the damage increase is not only small, but also conditional. His C2 is mid, since it only increases increases DPS by a small amount. His C4 is pretty viable since it increases normal attack speed when using his ultimate, which is not only good for himself but for other allies as well. And his C6 is actually meta since it provides a ton of front-loaded damage. For Cyno, his C1 increases his attack speed, which only adds a little bit of value, so this constellation is pretty mid. His C2 gives him a 50% electro damage bonus, which is definitely viable because it increases his DPS by a noticeable amount. For his C4, it provides your teammates with energy, excluding Cyno, the character who desperately needs energy, so this constellation is honestly pretty mid. For his C6, it increases his DPS significantly, so this constellation is honestly pretty meta. For Nailu, her C1 increases her hydro application, which is viable since she wants to be applying as much hydro as possible. For her C2, it decreases dendro and hydro resistances by 35%, which is actually a peak damage increase that even a new 6.0 character provides, aka Lauma. Her C6 provides her with up to 120% crit stats, but because the rest of her kits and constellations don't really synergize with crit stats, this constellation is pretty mid. For Wanderer, his C1 increases his attack speed and his damage by a little bit, so it's mid. For his C2, it increases his ultimate damage by around 40%, which makes it so that his ultimate is an actual viable source of damage, so it'll go in viable. For his C4, it's pretty RNG based and typically only increases his damage by around 15%, which is only slightly more than a C3 or C5 for some units, so it's mid. For his C6, it increases his DPS by significant amounts, similarly to Cyno, but unlike Cyno, Wanderer actually does a ton more damage, so his C6 will be peak. For Baishu, honestly the majority of his constellations just increase dendro application, healing, or energy by small amounts, so there isn't really a constellation that is above bad, other than his C6, which can arguably only be a mid constellation. So in conclusion, for your standard characters, aka for which free standard 5-star character to pick, aka for which free standard 5-star character to pick from the anniversary, you'll really only want C4 Jean, C6 Tenari, and C1, C2, or C6 for Dea. For the other standard 5-star constellations, pretty much every constellation is either yuck or bad. For mid through viable, there's a ton of constellations that'll still be good options in case you can't get the meta through peak constellations, or if you just want a nice boost in damage for one of your favorite characters. For the meta through peak constellations, Cyno C6, Wanderer C6, Eula C6, Yaemiko C6, Hutao C1, Ayaka C4, and Ayato C6 will all be incredibly good options because for the majority of these constellations, they increase their DPS by a significant amount to the point to where these 3 to 5-year-old units could actually reach meta levels of DPS. Now if you already have at least one C6 5-star character and you've already gotten all of the meta through peak level constellations, I honestly recommend choosing that C6 5-star so that you can get the new Masterless Stella Fortuna item that'll help you level up your characters to level 100, since even though it only results in around a 5% damage increase for most characters, that damage increase given to meta characters has far more value than even a 10 to 30% damage increase to a character that is years old. Also, leveling characters to level 100 can result in around 40% more damage for characters that deal a ton of damage through transformative reactions like bloom reactions or charge reactions, which will be really good considering that lately, with the release of Lauma and Flins, we've been focusing on these types of reactions. So for a quick example, increasing the damage of a new Nod-Krai unit like Flins by around 5 to 40% will offer far more value to your account than getting a C6 for someone like Baishu. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, feel free to comment. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.